I remember the exact moment we confirmed it. Not the vague speculation or philosophical musings, but the hard data that proved it beyond any doubt. That the world we knew, every brick, every blade of grass, every goddamn star in the sky, was nothing more than code. Our universe was a simulation. It started small, like all things do. A handful of quantum experiments yielding inconsistent results, particles behaving in ways we couldn't explain. At first, we thought it was just bad data or interference, but the inconsistencies kept appearing. My team at the UN Quantum Research Lab spent years refining the experiments, stripping away variables until we were left with only one explanation. The anomalies weren't random. They were artifacts of the simulation, glitches in the system, like bugs in any piece of software. It's funny to think how arrogant we were, standing there in front of those terminals, thinking we had uncovered the universe's deepest secret. We published the findings, and the world reacted the way you'd expect. Some people freaked out. Religious leaders called it blasphemy. Others latched onto it like a new gospel. But for most people, nothing changed. They still went to work, still paid their bills. Even in a simulated world, you've got to put food on the table. I was different. For me, the discovery was everything. I spent years trying to understand the architecture of the simulation, to find out who or what had created it, and why. It wasn't just idle curiosity. I needed answers. There's something about knowing you're just a string of code that drives a man mad. That's when the glitches started. I was sitting at my desk one morning, staring at some data streams when I reached for my coffee. Except, the cup wasn't there. 1 second it was right in front of me. The next it had just blinked out of existence. I remember staring at the empty spot on my desk, waiting for it to come back. And then it did. Just reappeared, exactly where it had been, like nothing happened. Over the next few weeks, the glitches became more frequent. It wasn't just objects disappearing anymore. I'd see people walking down the street. Then they'd freeze, mid-step. Just stop, like someone had hit pause on them. They'd stay like that for a few seconds, then continue walking as if nothing had happened. Then the first major glitch made the news. An entire neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro vanished overnight. Thousands of people, their homes, everything, just gone. The government sent in teams thinking it was some kind of terrorist attack or natural disaster. But there was no trace of anything. The buildings weren't destroyed, they had just ceased to exist. That's when the denial started. The governments, the corporations, all of them had too much invested in keeping the world stable. They downplayed the disappearances, called them anomalous events. They had to. Society would crumble if everyone knew the truth, that the world we lived in was breaking down, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. I tried to tell myself it was under control, that the glitches were isolated incidents, but whatever was running the simulation, it was starting to fail. Or maybe it wasn't failing at all. Maybe it was intentional. Maybe the operators, whoever they were, had decided we weren't worth the resources anymore. It wasn't until Grace and Ethan disappeared that I understood how wrong I was. It was a Sunday. I remember it because I had promised Ethan we'd go to the park, even though I had a backlog of research to sort through. Grace had been giving me hell for working too much. "You need to spend time with your family," she'd said, like I didn't know. But it was hard to focus on family when the universe was falling apart around you. I woke up early that morning. Ethan was already in the living room, playing with his tablet, his messy brown hair sticking up in every direction. Grace was in the kitchen, humming to herself while she made breakfast. It was a perfect, ordinary morning. And then, it wasn't. 1 second they were there, the next they weren't. The sound of Grace's humming cut off like someone had hit mute. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the empty space where she had been. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment I thought I was having some kind of breakdown. But the silence in the house was so thick it felt suffocating. I walked through the house, calling their names, opening every door, checking every room, even though I knew they weren't there. They hadn't left. They hadn't walked out the door. They were just gone. Like the cup. Like the people in Rio. Erased. I remember standing in Ethan's room staring at his unmade bed, his toy cars scattered across the floor. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, to rationalize it. But there was no rationalizing this. They were gone, and I was alone in an empty house, no explanation, no goodbye, nothing. I just sat at my desk, staring at the terminal, refreshing the news feeds, hoping for anything that would tell me this wasn't happening, that it was a mistake. But the news was the same. More glitches, more disappearances, more cover-ups. Over the next few days, I tore through every piece of data I could get my hands on. I wasn't the only one. The scientists who hadn't disappeared yet were all scrambling to figure out what was going on. We all knew the truth. The simulation was falling apart. But no one knew why or how to stop it. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. I couldn't think about anything but the code. If I could just crack it, if I could just figure out what was causing the glitches, maybe I could bring them back. I sat there, in front of my screen, surrounded by data I couldn't make sense of, knowing that it was only a matter of time before I was next. That's when the paranoia really set in. I started seeing glitches everywhere, every flash of light, every shadow that shifted wrong, every person who froze for just a second too long. It all felt like a warning, like the system was coming for me next. I told myself I could fix it, that if I just worked harder, if I just found the right line of code, I could stop the collapse. But deep down, I knew the truth. We were already dead. We just didn't know it yet. It didn't stop with Grace and Ethan. After they disappeared, I thought the worst had already happened, that I'd hit rock bottom. I was wrong. The world was just starting to come apart. At first, the disappearances seemed random. People, neighborhoods, whole sections of cities blinking out of existence, just gone without a trace. But then it got worse. Entire cities vanished overnight. Tokyo, then Moscow, then New York. Erased from the map as if they'd never been there in the first place. The news tried to keep up, but you could tell even they were losing control. Every broadcast became more frantic, more disjointed. One anchor just broke down in tears on live television before they cut the feed. I kept watching the news like a man obsessed, even though I knew it was pointless. The world was dying, and there was nothing any of us could do about it. Some people didn't even bother to pretend anymore. They took to the streets in riot gear, looting, fighting, burning down what was left. Why not? It wasn't like the cops were going to stop them. Hell, the cops were probably glitching out too. I tried not to leave the house after that. It didn't feel safe out there, not with everything breaking down. But I couldn't avoid it forever. Food was running low, and I needed supplies. I grabbed what I could from the wreckage of a grocery store and was heading back when I saw a group of people huddled together near the old hospital. They didn't look like rioters or looters. They looked scared, desperate. I kept my distance at first, watching them from behind the broken windows of an abandoned building. There were about a dozen of them, men, women, a few kids. They were talking, but it wasn't the panicked kind of conversation I'd heard from other survivors. It was organized, like they had a plan. One of them, a tall guy in military fatigues, was giving orders. The others listened. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I caught enough. They were planning to move, to get out of the city. I didn't know where they thought they could go, but it didn't matter. They had something I didn't: hope. Against my better judgment, I stepped out of my hiding place. My heart pounded as I approached them. For all I knew, they'd take one look at me and shoot. But they didn't. The guy in fatigues turned to face me, sizing me up with narrowed eyes. "You alone?" "Yeah," I replied. "I've been alone for a while." He stared at me for a moment, then gave a short nod. "We're leaving the city. If you want to come, you can. But we're moving fast, and we're not stopping for anyone. You fall behind. That's your problem." I didn't need to think about it. "I'm in." We left that night. The group moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the streets where the rioters still roamed. I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't really matter. Anywhere was better than here. As we moved through the city, I started to notice the glitches again. You could see the edges of reality fraying. In some places, entire buildings were fading in and out of existence like bad television reception. The guy in fatigues, his name was Lucas, told us to stay away from those areas. He said no one who went near them ever came back. I believed him. I'd seen it myself. People just disappearing. 1 second they were there, the next they were gone. No sound, no warning, just gone. Like the world had decided they didn't matter anymore. We walked in silence for hours. The city was a ghost town, empty and broken. At some point, we passed a row of cars parked haphazardly along the side of the road, all of them abandoned. One of the kids in the group, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, reached out and touched the side of a car as we passed. Her hand went straight through the metal like it wasn't even there. The girl screamed and yanked her hand back, clutching it to her chest. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something I couldn't hear. I glanced at Lucas, but he didn't even react. He just kept walking, eyes forward, like he'd seen it all before. I didn't know how much longer we could keep moving. The city was breaking down faster than we could walk through it. The glitches were spreading, whole blocks disappearing behind us, entire sections of the skyline fading out like someone was erasing them with an invisible hand. We stopped for a break near an old subway entrance. The group gathered around in a loose circle, and I finally got a chance to talk to some of them. Lucas, it turned out, was former military. He didn't say much about his past, but it was clear he was in charge. The others were a mix. Some were locals, others had come from nearby cities looking for somewhere safe. None of them had found it. We all had the same questions. Where were the glitches coming from? How much longer did we have before everything was gone? But there were no answers, just fear. Some of the group still believed there was a way to escape, that if we got far enough from the city, we'd find somewhere untouched by the glitches. I wanted to believe them, but I knew better. The simulation was global. There was nowhere to run. As the night wore on, the tension in the group grew. People were tired, scared, desperate for anything that would make sense of the chaos. One of the women, a wiry redhead named Kelly, argued that we should stop running and try to make a stand. She thought we could figure out how to survive the glitches if we stayed in one place long enough. Lucas shut her down immediately. "There's no standing against this," he said, his voice cold. "You try to fight the glitches, you die, end of story." That didn't sit well with everyone. Some of them weren't willing to follow Lucas forever. They wanted a solution, something more than running until we got erased like everyone else. I tried to stay out of the argument. I wasn't a leader. Hell, I wasn't even a soldier. I was just a man who had spent too much time thinking he could fix the world, only to watch it fall apart around him. But as I sat there, listening to them argue, I couldn't help but think about the data I'd been poring over before I left the house. I still didn't understand the full scope of the glitches, but one thing was clear. The more the system broke down, the more dangerous it became. We didn't just have to worry about getting erased. We had to worry about the laws of physics turning against us. That night we lost 2 people. They were on watch while the rest of us slept. No one heard anything, no screams, no struggle. 1 minute they were there, the next, they were gone. Just like the others. The group was falling apart. The disappearances, the glitches, it was too much for people to handle. And it wasn't just the fear of dying. It was the uncertainty, the knowledge that at any second you could just stop existing. No warning, no explanation. I started to wonder how much longer I could keep going. I hadn't thought about Grace and Ethan in days, and that scared me more than anything else. How could I have forgotten them so easily? But there was no time to dwell on it. The world was coming undone, and we had to keep moving. Lucas pushed us harder after the disappearances. He didn't say it, but we all knew what he was thinking. We were running out of time. By the next day, the glitches were everywhere. Buildings wavered like bad holograms, streets warped and twisted, parts of the city folding in on themselves like crumpled paper. And then, while we were passing through a narrow alley, the ground beneath us started to glitch. I barely had time to react. One of the men in the group, a guy named Derek, stepped forward and his foot went right through the ground. He screamed, but it was too late. His whole body glitched, and then he was gone. The rest of us just stood there, too shocked to move. Lucas didn't hesitate. He signaled for us to move, and we bolted. We kept running, not stopping until we were miles away, leaving the alley and the glitching ground far behind. The city was no longer a place you could survive. We all knew that, even if some of us tried to pretend otherwise. The glitches were spreading faster, swallowing entire blocks in minutes, and there was no way to predict where they would hit next. We had to get out, but every step we took was a gamble. Every street we crossed a roll of the dice. It wasn't just people disappearing anymore. Now the very ground beneath our feet couldn't be trusted. Lucas led us out, keeping the pace quick and quiet. There were only 7 of us left now. The others, the ones who had vanished, felt like distant memories. None of us talked about Derek or the others who had blinked out of existence. Talking about them meant accepting the reality of it, and no one was ready for that. Lucas had picked up a lead on a so-called safe zone outside the city. We didn't know what that meant, really. Someone had heard rumors about an area untouched by the glitches, a place where the collapse hadn't reached yet. That kind of hope felt like grasping at smoke. But what else did we have? We followed him because there was nothing else to do. The streets were dead, and not just because the city was emptying out. They felt hollow, like they were only pretending to be real. Some corners of buildings seemed to shimmer, light bending as if reality was struggling to keep its shape. I caught glimpses of objects out of the corner of my eye. A car, a streetlight, that would come in and out, sometimes gone for a moment, sometimes for good. I learned not to focus on them too much. Trying to process what was happening to the world around me made my head hurt, made me feel like I was losing myself in the same way the city was dissolving. Lucas kept us moving. The man was like a machine, always focused, eyes scanning the surroundings, calculating the next move. I didn't know what kept him going. He never talked about himself, and none of us asked. We were all too busy trying to outrun our own nightmares. We were cutting through what used to be a quiet residential district when it happened again. It started with the ground, the pavement beneath our feet, shimmering like bad reception on an old screen. I saw it first, but before I could shout a warning, the woman in front of me, Kelly, stepped right into the glitch. One moment she was there, her foot hovering above the solid ground, and then she wasn't. She didn't even have time to scream. Her body shimmered, disintegrating into fractured pixels, dissolving into the air like she was being erased from a photograph. 1 second I could see her red hair bouncing as she walked. The next there was nothing but empty space. The rest of us stopped dead in our tracks. We all stared at the spot where she'd been, too shocked to move. It was like watching someone drop through a trapdoor that you didn't know existed. 1 minute they're part of the world, the next, they aren't. Lucas was the first to snap out of it, signaling for us to keep moving, pushing forward without hesitation. He didn't give us time to process what had just happened or react to the loss. I wanted to confront him, to demand if he even cared that we'd just lost another person. But I stayed silent. Maybe I already knew the answer. Maybe I was afraid I'd stop caring as well. All I understood in that moment was that if we lingered any longer, the ground could open up beneath us too. We pushed on, avoiding the parts of the street that looked too thin, too warped. The world was falling apart faster now. Every few blocks, the buildings around us would tremble, shivering like they were about to collapse, then blur out of existence. The skyline itself was crumbling, whole sections of the city disappearing in the distance, leaving behind gaps in the horizon where towers had once stood. It seemed we were endlessly circling back, even though Lucas kept saying we were almost at the city's edge. It was hard to trust anything when the world looked like a bad dream, when you couldn't tell if the ground beneath you was real. For all I knew, we were chasing ghosts. The further we went, the more twisted the environment became. Some buildings seemed to grow and shrink, their walls bending as if the laws of physics were losing their grip. At one point, I saw a tree floating in midair, its roots dangling into nothingness, as if the ground had simply forgotten to support it. We gave it a wide berth. No one said a word. I was starting to doubt we'd ever find this safe zone. The whole idea of a place untouched by the glitches felt ridiculous now. How could any part of the simulation be stable when everything else was falling apart? But I kept my mouth shut. I didn't want to be the one to destroy whatever thin thread of hope we had left. We hit a particularly bad stretch as we crossed a narrow bridge over what had once been a river. Now, the water below was glitching, shimmering in and out of existence, creating gaps where the current should have been. Halfway across, the bridge began to dissolve. The steel beams trembled, warping like they were made of rubber. Lucas signaled urgently, and we bolted. The bridge fluctuated beneath my feet, the metal warping and shimmering as if the simulation couldn't decide whether it should exist. Behind us, there was a sound like static tearing through the air, and when I glanced back, half the bridge had simply vanished, erased mid-span, leaving nothing but empty space. By the time we reached the other side, the entire bridge was gone, replaced by a gaping void where it had once been. There was no way back now, only the emptiness behind us. The group was down to 5 of us. Lucas, me, a woman named Linda, and 2 younger men who I hadn't spoken to much. None of us had the energy to talk. We were too busy keeping our eyes on the ground, making sure the next step we took wouldn't be our last. Hours passed. The sun was setting, but even the sky looked fractured, like someone had taken a knife to it and sliced the clouds apart. The air felt thin, as if the simulation was forgetting how to create the atmosphere we needed to breathe. I was exhausted, but I couldn't let myself stop. I knew that if I let myself rest for even a minute, the glitches would catch up to me. And then I'd be gone, like the others. It was just after nightfall when we reached the edge of the city, or what was left of it. We stood on a hill overlooking the remains of the skyline, watching as the last of the buildings disappeared into the darkness. Beyond the city there was nothing. No lights, no roads, no horizon. Just an empty void stretching out in every direction. "This is it," Lucas said. "We're out." I stared into the dark void, trying to make sense of it. There was no safe zone, no refuge, just a space where the world had once been. We hadn't escaped the glitches, we had merely reached the edge of the map. "No," I muttered. "This can't be it." But it was. We had reached the end of the simulation. There was nowhere left to go. The others didn't say anything. We all knew what it meant. The glitches weren't going to stop. They were coming for us too, sooner or later. We could run all we wanted, but there was no outrunning the end of the world. Lucas stood there, staring out into the void. Maybe he'd known all along. Maybe he'd just been trying to give us something to hold on to for as long as he could. I couldn't tell. And in that moment, I didn't care. I looked out at the emptiness in front of us. This was how it ended. Not with a bang or a fight, but with a slow, creeping erasure. Piece by piece, the world would be taken from us, until there was nothing left. I thought about Grace, about Ethan, how they'd vanished without a trace, without any warning. Maybe they had been lucky. They didn't have to see this. They didn't have to feel the world slipping away under their feet, to watch everything they'd ever known crumble into nothing. The collapse was coming for us, and there was nowhere left to run. We stood there, staring out at the edge of nothingness. It was hard to look at for too long, like staring into the infinite. I tried to make sense of it, tried to see something that wasn't there, but the nothingness swallowed every attempt. Lucas was silent beside me. The others just stood there, waiting for some kind of direction. But none came. There was no plan, no hope. This was it. Is this what we came for? Linda asked. To watch it all end? I glanced at Lucas, expecting him to give us some final command, to tell us where to go, what to do. But he just stood there, staring into the void, like he was waiting for it to take him. Lucas, I said, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. What do we do now? He didn't answer. He didn't even look at me. Maybe he didn't have an answer, or maybe he knew it didn't matter. I felt something deep in my chest, a kind of resignation I hadn't let myself feel until now. There was no escaping this. We'd run out of places to go. There was no safe zone, no last refuge. This was the end. I took a deep breath, the air thin and cold, and turned back to the void. For a moment I let myself believe that maybe there was something on the other side of it. Maybe once everything disappeared, there'd be something else. But that was just another lie we told ourselves to keep going. The last remnants of the city vanished behind us. Linda let out a choked sob, and one of the younger men sank to his knees, staring blankly into the darkness. I wanted to comfort them, to say something that would make it easier, but the words wouldn't come. We were standing at the edge of the world, staring into that empty void when I saw a faint glow on the horizon. It wasn't the sun. This light was different, like the flash of a screen coming to life. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and the more I looked, the clearer it became. The light was rising, slowly, spreading across the horizon like a wave. It started as a thin line, stretching out across the empty sky, but it was growing, swelling, pushing toward us. It didn't behave like light should. It didn't reflect off the buildings or cast shadows. It was as if the fabric of the world was glowing, radiating from deep inside the simulation itself. I watched, rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from it. The others had noticed it too. Lucas stood still, staring straight ahead as the glow intensified, creeping toward us. Linda muttered something under her breath, her face pale, but I couldn't make out the words. I doubt they mattered. The light grew brighter, swallowing the distant skyline, the buildings dissolving into the white haze as if they'd never been there. I took a step back, instinctively, but where was there to go? It was coming for us, slow but inevitable, erasing everything in its path. It was everywhere now, spreading across the horizon, a wall of pure, blinding white surging toward us like a tidal wave. It was coming faster now, accelerating, as if the simulation had decided to hurry up and finish the job. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the light had pinned me in place, freezing me in its path. I could feel it getting closer, feel the heatless glow against my skin, like I was standing on the edge of a nuclear blast. The air around me shimmered, warping, bending as reality started to tear apart at the seams. When the light hit us, I was nowhere and everywhere at once, suspended in the light, waiting for the end. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I blinked, trying to clear the afterimage from my eyes. I expected to be gone, to find myself erased like the others. But I wasn't. I was still here, standing in the same place, at the edge of the void. Only, it wasn't the void anymore. The city was back. I stood frozen, struggling to process what I was seeing. The skyline that had disappeared just moments ago was intact, the buildings standing tall against the horizon. The streets were clean, the lights glowing in the windows of apartments and office buildings. Cars moved down the roads in neat, orderly lines, and I could hear the distant noise of life returning. It was like nothing had ever happened. I turned to Lucas, but he was gone. The others too, Linda, the young man, all of them. I was alone, standing on the edge of the hill, looking out at a city that wasn't there minutes ago. I'd seen it end. I'd seen the world collapse. How could it be back? My head spun, a deep sinking feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. I felt a wave of panic rising in my chest. I started walking, then running, down the hill and into the city. Everything was normal. People walked by me on the sidewalks, talking, laughing, carrying on as if the world hadn't just collapsed. The shops were open, cars honked at each other in the usual evening traffic. I stumbled past a cafe, and out of the corner of my eye I saw something. A woman, sitting at a table by the window, her back to me. Long, dark hair. Familiar. I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. It couldn't be. I stepped closer, my pulse racing, and just for a second, I caught her reflection in the window. It was Grace. My feet wouldn't move. I stood there staring at her through the glass, my mind screaming that it wasn't possible, that she was gone. But there she was, sitting with a cup of coffee, smiling, as if none of it had ever happened, as if Ethan had never disappeared. I took a step forward, ready to shout, to run to her, but then I saw a flash, just for a split second, around her. A glitch. Her face blurred, her hand shimmering like static on a broken screen. And then it stopped. She was back to normal, sitting there, drinking her coffee, none the wiser. The realization hit me. We hadn't escaped the collapse. We hadn't survived. It had all been rebooted. The simulation had started over, wiping the slate clean, rebuilding everything like nothing had happened. But it wasn't the same. There were differences, tiny fractures in reality that only I seemed to notice. The people around me were just rerun versions of themselves, going through the motions. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be erased, along with the rest of them. But somehow, I remembered. The world kept moving around me, oblivious to what had happened, to what was happening again. I stood there, frozen, as the truth sunk in. The shutdown was coming again. This was just the beginning of another cycle, another collapse, and no one would ever know, except me.